You stepped on my mama on purpose. The 8-year-old girl's voice cuts through the airplane cabin like a knife. Passengers in every row turn to stare. Some pull out their phones. Others gasp. And there, standing in the middle of the aisle, is little Ameena Washington, her hand shaking as she points directly at flight attendant Jacinta Morrison. Jacinta's face drains of color because Ameena is holding up her phone, recording everything. Every word. Every expression. Every lie that's about to come out of Jacinta's mouth. What this flight attendant doesn't know yet is that this moment, this confrontation with an 8-year-old girl, is about to cost her everything. Her job. Her freedom. Her entire future. But how did we get here? How does a routine flight turn into a viral scandal that ends with a flight attendant being let off a plane in handcuffs? To understand that, we need to go back 2 hours. Back to when this journey began. Divine Washington had been dreading this day for weeks. Not the flight itself, though at 7 months pregnant, the idea of being crammed into an economy seat for 4 hours wasn't exactly appealing. No, what Divine dreaded was doing this alone. Her husband Victor, a sergeant in the army, was deployed overseas. He wouldn't be back for another 3 months. He'd missed the birth of their second child. He'd missed those final precious weeks of Divine's pregnancy. And Divine, a 34-year-old kindergarten teacher from Atlanta, was exhausted. Bone-deep, soul-tired exhausted. Her ankles were swollen to twice their normal size. Her back ached constantly, a dull throb that never quite went away. Every time she stood up, it felt like her entire body was protesting. But she couldn't do this alone. She couldn't spend the final months of her pregnancy by herself in their small Atlanta apartment, waiting for Victor to come home. That's why she'd scraped together every spare dollar from her teacher's salary to buy these plane tickets. She and Ameena were flying to Seattle to stay with Divine's sister Jem. At least there she'd have help. At least there she wouldn't be alone when the baby came. 8-year-old Ameena understood more than most children her age. She'd had to grow up fast. When your father is deployed to a war zone, when your mother is pregnant and struggling, you learn to be helpful. You learn to be observant. You learn to carry more than just your own backpack. Ameena was bright, sharp as a tack, and fiercely protective of her mother. She'd heard the tremor in Divine's voice when she talked about the flight. She'd seen her mother wince when she thought Ameena wasn't looking. And she'd made herself a promise. She was going to take care of her mama, just like Daddy asked her to. This was Ameena's first time on an airplane, and despite everything she was excited. Nervous too, but mostly excited. She'd watched videos online about what to expect. She'd packed her own backpack with snacks and a book and her tablet. She'd even written a checklist to make sure they didn't forget anything. Because that's what Ameena did. She helped. She planned. She made things easier for her mother however she could. When they arrived at the airport that morning, Divine was already exhausted. They'd left their apartment at 5 in the morning to catch their 9 o'clock flight, and the drive through Atlanta traffic had been brutal. By the time they made it through security and reached their gate, Divine was walking like every step caused her pain. Which, to be fair, it did. Ameena carried both their small backpacks, one on each shoulder, even though they were heavy. She didn't complain. She just stayed close to her mother, watching her carefully, ready to help if Divine needed anything. Divine sank into one of the hard plastic chairs at the gate and immediately felt guilty. She turned to Ameena with an apologetic smile and said she was sorry for moving so slowly. But Ameena just shook her head and told her mama not to worry. Then Ameena noticed the way Divine's face tightened, the way her hand moved to her belly. The 8-year-old's eyes went wide with concern, and she asked if the baby was okay. Divine assured her daughter that everything was fine, just regular pregnancy aches. The baby was moving around, getting comfortable. These things happened. But Ameena wasn't entirely convinced, so she did what she'd seen her father do 100 times. She moved behind her mother's chair and gently rubbed Divine's shoulders, trying to ease some of the tension she could feel knotted there. They sat like that for 20 minutes, Ameena massaging her mother's shoulders while Divine tried not to cry from the simple kindness of it. Around them, the gate filled with other passengers. Business travelers in suits, typing frantically on laptops. Families with young children already looking stressed. College students with oversized backpacks half asleep. Just another Friday morning flight from Atlanta to Seattle. Nothing special. Nothing memorable. Or so everyone thought. When the gate agent announced boarding, Divine and Ameena waited patiently. They were in Group 4, economy seats toward the back of the plane. No priority boarding for them. No first-class comfort. Just seats 32E and 32F, a middle and a window in the very back of the aircraft. Divine held Ameena's hand as they joined the line, and together they shuffled down the jet bridge, taking their time because Divine couldn't move any faster. Now, while Divine and Ameena were making their way onto that plane, full of hope that this flight would be uneventful, there was someone else preparing for their workday. Someone who was about to make the worst decision of her professional life. Her name was Jacinta Morrison, and she'd been a flight attendant with Pinnacle Airways for 15 years. 15 years of serving drinks at 30,000 feet. 15 years of smiling at passengers who treated her like she was invisible. 15 years of being passed over for promotions, watching younger, less experienced flight attendants get moved into senior positions while she stayed exactly where she was. Jacinta was 42 years old, recently divorced, and bitter about pretty much everything in her life. She blamed affirmative action for her stalled career. She blamed her ex-husband for their financial struggles. She blamed passengers for being demanding and entitled. The truth was, Jacinta blamed everyone but herself. And on this particular morning, after another argument with her ex about alimony payments, after another rejection for a supervisor position, Jacinta Morrison was in the worst mood of her life. She stood at the airplane door with her practiced smile, greeting passengers as they boarded, but inside she was seething. When Divine and Ameena reached the door, Divine offered a polite good morning, the way she greeted everyone. It was just who she was. Kind, courteous, trying to make the world a little brighter wherever she went. But when Jacinta saw Divine very visibly pregnant, holding hands with a young black girl, something ugly flickered across her face. The smile dropped for just a second. She noticed the pregnancy and she made a face. Not a big one. Just a slight curl of her lip, a narrowing of her eyes. The kind of look that says, of course. Of course you'd be pregnant. Of course you'd be taking up space on my plane. Divine either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, continuing down the aisle with Ameena. But as they passed, Jacinta muttered 2 words under her breath. Just 2 words, quiet enough that most people wouldn't hear. But Ameena heard. Of course. That's what Jacinta said. Of course. And Ameena, confused, looked back at the flight attendant, trying to understand what she meant. Why would someone say that? What did of course mean? But Divine was moving forward, and Ameena had to keep up, so she filed it away in her mind. Something wasn't right about that woman. Something in her voice, in her eyes, made Ameena uneasy. They found their seats, 32E and 32F, nestled in the back of the plane where the engine noise would be loudest and the bathroom smells would occasionally drift over. Divine tried to settle into the middle seat, but it was immediately clear this was going to be uncomfortable. The seatbelt barely fit around her pregnant belly. She had to extend it as far as it would go, and even then, it pressed against her in a way that made her wince. Her back was already aching from the walk down the aisle, and now she had to figure out how to sit for 4 hours in a space clearly not designed for someone 7 months pregnant. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Ameena noticed everything. She noticed the way her mother struggled to buckle the seatbelt. She noticed the sharp intake of breath when Divine finally got settled. She noticed the way her mama's hand moved to her lower back, pressing against the ache that never seemed to go away. So Ameena did what she could. She took the small pillow from her own seat and helped her mother position it behind her back. She made sure Divine's water bottle was within easy reach. She asked 3 times if there was anything else she could do. And Divine, trying so hard to be strong, assured her daughter that she was fine. Everything was fine. They'd be in Seattle before they knew it, and Aunt Jem would be waiting for them with her big smile and her warm hugs, and everything would be okay. But everything was not okay. Because 4 rows ahead, Jacinta Morrison was having a conversation with another flight attendant about the passengers in the back. And when she mentioned the pregnant woman in 32E, her voice dripped with contempt. She didn't say Divine's name. She didn't need to. The way she said, that one in the back, made it clear exactly who she was talking about. And unfortunately for everyone on that plane, Jacinta Morrison's bad day was about to become Divine Washington's nightmare. Here's what I want to know. Have you ever been on a flight where you witnessed a passenger being mistreated? Drop your story in the comments because what happened next is going to shock you. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule. The safety demonstration played on the overhead screens. Flight attendants walked the aisles, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. Everything seemed normal. Routine. Just another flight. But Ameena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept thinking about the way that flight attendant had looked at her mother. The way she'd said, of course, like it meant something ugly. And as the plane taxied toward the runway, Ameena made a decision. She was going to watch that woman. She was going to pay attention. Because if that flight attendant tried anything, if she was mean to her mama, Ameena was going to do something about it. She didn't know what yet, but she'd figure it out. After all, her daddy had told her she was the protector now. And Ameena Washington took that job very seriously. 10 minutes into the flight, that little seatbelt sign finally dinged off. You know the one. The sound that tells passengers they're free to move about the cabin. For most people it's just background noise. But for Divine Washington, 7 months pregnant and sitting in that cramped middle seat with her bladder pressing against a baby who seemed determined to use it as a pillow, that sound was pure relief. She'd been holding it since before they boarded, trying not to cause a fuss, trying not to be that passenger who needs special accommodations. But biology doesn't care about politeness, and Divine needed to use the bathroom. Now, she unbuckled her seatbelt carefully, the way pregnant women do when every movement requires calculation. Ameena immediately looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read, concern written all over her 8-year-old face. Divine gave her daughter what she hoped was a reassuring smile and told her she'd be right back. Then she stood up, steadying herself against the seat in front of her, and began the long journey up the aisle toward the bathroom. And when you're 7 months pregnant on an airplane, every step is a journey. Divine had to turn sideways to fit between the seats. She had to pause every few steps to catch her balance. Her back was screaming at her, her feet were throbbing, and she was acutely aware that every single passenger she passed was watching her navigate this obstacle course of an aisle. Up near the front galley, 2 flight attendants were preparing for the beverage service. One of them was Jacinta Morrison, still stewing in her bad mood, still wearing that fake smile like a mask. The other was Shama Davis, 28 years old and relatively new to the job. Shama had only been flying for Pinnacle Airways for 6 months, and she still had that optimism that comes before the job beats it out of you. She still smiled at passengers because she genuinely wanted them to have a good flight. She still went out of her way to help people because that's what she thought the job was supposed to be about. And when she saw Divine struggling up the aisle, very obviously pregnant and very obviously in discomfort, Shama's first instinct was to help. She stepped forward, ready to offer Divine an arm to hold onto, ready to ask if she needed anything. But before Shama could get a word out, Jacinta cut her off with a sharp comment that dripped with disdain. "She's fine," Jacinta said. "Stop babying people." The words were harsh enough that Shama actually stepped back, surprised. But Jacinta wasn't looking at her. Jacinta was watching Divine make her way toward the bathroom, and the expression on her face was something cold. Something mean. Shama felt it in her gut, that uncomfortable recognition that her colleague, the woman she'd been working with all morning, might not be a good person. But what was she supposed to do? Call out a senior flight attendant for being rude? Risk her own job 6 months in? So Shama did what so many people do when they witness something wrong. She stayed quiet. She told herself it wasn't her business. She turned back to organizing the beverage cart and tried to ignore the sick feeling in her stomach. Divine finally reached the bathroom, breathing hard from the exertion of that short walk, and her heart sank. There was a line. 3 people waiting, shifting their weight impatiently, checking their phones. Divine took her place at the back, leaning against the wall because her back hurt too much to stand unsupported. She stood there for several minutes and each one felt like an eternity. The baby was pressing down on her bladder with what felt like malicious intent. Her feet were throbbing in her shoes. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead even though the cabin was cool. And she was trying so hard not to think about how badly she needed that bathroom because thinking about it only made it worse. The passenger directly in front of Divine, a man in his 50s wearing a business suit, glanced back at her. He saw the pregnancy. He saw the discomfort written all over her face. And he did what any decent person would do. He gestured toward the bathroom door and told Divine she could go ahead of him. The kindness of it nearly made Divine cry. She thanked him profusely, relief flooding through her, and moved forward. But she'd only taken 1 step when a sharp voice cut through the narrow corridor. "Excuse me. There's a line for a reason." Jacinta Morrison had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, her arms crossed, her expression stern. Divine froze, immediately embarrassed. She apologized quickly, explaining that she was so sorry, that this passenger had offered to let her go first, that she was pregnant and really needed to use the bathroom. But Jacinta wasn't interested in explanations. She cut Divine off mid-sentence with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Everyone has problems," Jacinta said, her voice loud enough that other passengers were starting to notice. "Please wait your turn like everyone else." The businessman who'd offered to let Divine go ahead couldn't believe what he was hearing. He spoke up, his voice firm, pointing out that he had literally just told this woman to go ahead of him. It was his spot in line. He could give it to whoever he wanted. But Jacinta turned her cold gaze on him and told him in a tone that allowed no argument that she was going to need him to lower his voice or return to his seat. The threat was implicit but clear. Cause trouble and you'll be the problem. The businessman looked at Divine, looked at Jacinta, and made a calculation. He wasn't willing to risk being thrown off a flight over this. So he backed down, shaking his head in disgust, but backing down nonetheless. Divine felt her face burning with humiliation. Tears were forming in her eyes, and she desperately tried to blink them away. She told Jacinta it was okay, that she could wait, her voice barely above a whisper. She backed up to her original spot in line, and Jacinta walked away satisfied, like she'd just won some important victory. Divine stood there for another 10 minutes, her bladder screaming, her back aching, her feet throbbing, and her eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. Because that's what she'd been taught her whole life. Don't make a scene. Don't cause trouble. Just endure it. Just get through it. Back in seat 32F, Ameena was watching everything. The seats were far back, but Ameena had a clear line of sight up the aisle. She'd seen that flight attendant stop her mother. She'd seen the way the nice man in the suit had backed away. She'd seen her mother shrink into herself, embarrassed and hurt. And Ameena felt something she'd rarely felt in her young life. Anger. Not the kind of anger that comes from not getting your way or being told no. Real anger. The kind that burns in your chest and makes your hands shake. Because someone was being mean to her mama, and her mama didn't deserve that. Nobody deserved that. Divine finally got to use the bathroom, and by the time she emerged she was shaking. Not just from the relief but from the embarrassment, from the cruelty of what had just happened. She took a moment to compose herself, splashing cold water on her face, gripping the tiny sink to steady herself. Then she took a deep breath and opened the door to begin the long walk back to her seat. And that's when everything got worse. She'd only made it about halfway down the aisle when the plane hit a patch of mild turbulence. Nothing major. Just enough to make the aircraft shudder slightly, enough to make the overhead bins rattle. The captain's voice came over the intercom with that standard announcement asking passengers to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Divine was already trying to do exactly that. She was moving as quickly as she could, which for a 7-month pregnant woman on an unstable airplane was not very quick at all. She gripped the tops of the seats as she passed, using them to steady herself, taking careful steps because the last thing she needed was to fall. And then, near row 28, she looked up and saw Jacinta Morrison coming toward her from the other direction. Jacinta was checking the overhead bins, making sure everything was secured before the turbulence got worse. They met in that narrow aisle, barely wide enough for one person, certainly not wide enough for a pregnant woman and a flight attendant to pass each other comfortably. Divine immediately apologized, asking politely if she could just squeeze by. But Jacinta's response was sharp. She told Divine that she needed to sit down, that the captain had made an announcement, her tone dripping with condescension. Divine, still trying to be polite despite everything, explained that she was trying to get back to her seat, if Jacinta could just move slightly to let her pass. But Jacinta didn't move. She stood there, blocking the aisle, making Divine work for every inch of space. Divine had no choice but to turn sideways and squeeze past, pressing against the seats, her pregnant belly brushing against Jacinta's uniform. And that's when it happened. As Divine squeezed past, focusing all her attention on not losing her balance during the turbulence, Jacinta looked down at Divine's left foot. And then, deliberately, purposefully, with full awareness of what she was doing, Jacinta Morrison lifted her foot and stepped down hard on Divine's toes. The sound Divine made was somewhere between a gasp and a cry. Pure, sharp pain shot through her foot and up her leg. She stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest seat to keep from falling, her other hand instinctively going to her belly to protect the baby. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only process the throbbing agony in her foot and the terror that she might have hurt the baby. Jacinta's voice cut through the haze of pain with a casual, almost bored apology. "Oh, sorry," she said. "Maybe if you'd returned to your seat faster like I told you to, this wouldn't have happened." Divine didn't respond. Couldn't respond. She just focused on getting back to her seat without falling, without crying, without completely breaking down in the middle of this airplane. Each step on her injured foot sent fresh waves of pain through her body. The turbulence wasn't helping. The aisle seemed impossibly long. But finally she reached row 32 and collapsed into her seat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely buckle her seatbelt. Ameena saw her mother's face and immediately knew something was very wrong. She asked what happened, her voice high with worry. Divine tried to reassure her, tried to say she was okay, that she'd just bumped her foot. But even as she said it, she was bending down to unlace her shoe with trembling fingers. When she finally got it off, both she and Ameena stared at her foot in horror. It was already swelling. Already turning an angry red color where Jacinta's heel had come down. Divine's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back, and she cradled her belly with both hands, terrified that the stress, the pain, the shock of it all might hurt the baby. But here's what Divine didn't know. Here's what Jacinta Morrison had forgotten in her moment of cruelty. Ameena had been watching. Ameena had seen everything from her window seat. She'd watched that flight attendant approach her mother in the aisle. She'd watched them meet. She'd watched the way her mother had asked politely to pass by. And she'd watched, with perfect clarity, as that flight attendant looked down at her mother's foot and deliberately stepped on it. There was no accident. No crowded aisle mishap. It was intentional. It was cruel. And Ameena had witnessed every second of it. Ameena Washington was not a confrontational child. She'd been raised to be polite, to respect adults, to follow rules. Her parents had taught her to be kind, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to assume the best in others. But Ameena was also her father's daughter. And her father had taught her something else before he deployed. He'd knelt down to her level, looked her straight in the eyes, and told her that she was the protector now. That while he was gone, it was her job to take care of Mama. To watch out for her. To make sure she was safe. And 8-year-old Ameena had taken that responsibility seriously. She'd packed the bags. She'd carried the backpacks. She'd rubbed her mother's shoulders at the gate. She'd done everything she could to help. But now someone had hurt her Mama. On purpose. Right in front of her. And Ameena didn't know what to do with the rage that was building in her small chest. She watched Jacinta Morrison continue down the aisle as if nothing had happened. Watched her check the overhead bins, chat casually with another passenger, laugh at something someone said. Like she hadn't just deliberately injured a pregnant woman. Like it meant nothing to her. And maybe it didn't. Maybe to Jacinta, Divine was just another passenger. Just another inconvenience in her terrible day. But to Ameena, Divine was everything. Divine was Mama. And nobody got to hurt Mama. The woman sitting in seat 32D, an aisle seat in their row, had noticed Divine's distress. She leaned over and asked quietly if Divine was okay, if she needed anything. Divine, still trying so hard to hold it together, still trying not to cause a scene, told her she'd be fine. But she wasn't fine. Her foot was swelling visibly now, the skin tight and painful. Every throb sent a spike of pain up her leg. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, one hand on her injured foot and the other on her belly, feeling for movement, needing to know the baby was okay. Ameena couldn't stay quiet anymore. She told her mother, her voice shaking but determined, that the flight attendant had stepped on her on purpose. That she'd seen it. Divine immediately tried to dismiss it, tried to explain that it was an accident, that the aisle was crowded, that these things happened. But Ameena cut her off. "No, Mama," she said. Her voice was louder now, more insistent. "She looked right at your foot and stepped on it. I watched her do it." Divine felt her world tilting. Because if Ameena was right, if this hadn't been an accident, then what did that mean? It meant someone had deliberately hurt her. Someone had seen her pregnant and vulnerable and in pain and had chosen to cause her more pain. The thought was almost too horrible to process. Divine didn't want it to be true. She didn't want to believe that someone could be that cruel. So she did what so many people do when faced with inexplicable cruelty. She made excuses. She told Ameena to please just let it go. That they needed to get through this flight. That causing trouble wouldn't help anything. That it was easier to just endure it and forget about it once they landed. But Ameena couldn't forget it. She sat in that window seat, her jaw set in a way that made her look years older than 8, and she stared at that flight attendant's back as Jacinta moved through the cabin. She'd never seen someone hurt her mother on purpose before. Never witnessed that kind of casual cruelty. And she didn't understand it. Didn't understand how a grown woman could look at someone who was pregnant and struggling and decide to make it worse. It didn't make sense. It wasn't fair. And everything Ameena had been taught about right and wrong was screaming at her that this couldn't just be ignored. She remembered her father's words. "You're the protector now. Take care of Mama." Those words echoed in her head as she watched her mother cry silently, as she saw the swelling get worse, as she heard Divine's sharp intake of breath every time she accidentally moved her injured foot. Ameena had promised her father she'd protect her mother. She'd promised. And she was failing. Because right now Mama was hurt, and Ameena hadn't stopped it from happening. The plane leveled out. The turbulence passed. The seatbelt sign dinged off again. Life on the aircraft continued as normal for everyone except the Washingtons in row 32. Divine sat there with her swollen foot, trying to compose herself, trying to stop crying, trying to figure out how she was going to walk off this plane when they landed. Ameena sat there with her small fists clenched in her lap, her mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. Because she knew, even if her mother didn't want to admit it, that what had happened wasn't okay. That it couldn't just be ignored. That someone needed to do something. The question is, have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly and wished you'd spoken up? Because what this 8-year-old girl does next is going to change everything. And if you want to see how this story ends, you better hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next few minutes is absolutely unbelievable. Ameena sat in that seat, her young mind working through the problem like a puzzle. Her father had taught her about chain of command. About how in the military, if someone wasn't doing their job right, you went to their superior. But who was the superior on an airplane? Ameena thought back to boarding, to walking down that jet bridge. She remembered seeing a pilot at the door, greeting passengers. She remembered thinking he looked important in his uniform with all those stripes on his shoulders. Pilots were in charge of planes. Pilots were like captains. If someone was doing something wrong on the plane, wouldn't the pilot be the one to tell? But Ameena was 8 years old. She'd never confronted an adult about anything serious before. She'd never reported someone for doing something wrong. And the idea of walking up to the front of the plane, past all those passengers, past that mean flight attendant, to knock on the cockpit door and tell the pilot what happened, it terrified her. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was just a kid making up stories? What if they got mad at her for bothering them? What if they got mad at her mother? Divine was still crying quietly, trying to hide it from Ameena, trying to be strong. But Ameena could see right through it. Could see the pain written all over her mother's face. Could see the way Divine kept touching her belly, worried about the baby. Could see the foot swelling larger with every passing minute. And Ameena made a decision. A decision that would change everything. She didn't know if it was the right decision. Didn't know if it would work. But she knew she had to try. Because her father had trusted her to protect her mother. And Ameena Washington was not going to let him down. An hour into the flight, the cabin had settled into that familiar rhythm of air travel. The initial excitement of takeoff had faded. Passengers were reading, sleeping, working on laptops, scrolling through their phones. The hum of the engines provided a constant backdrop of white noise. Everything seemed normal. Routine. Just another Friday afternoon somewhere over the middle of the country. But in row 32 nothing was normal. Divine Washington sat with her injured foot elevated as much as the cramped space would allow, the swelling now impossible to ignore. Ameena sat beside her, watchful and tense, her young mind still processing what had happened, still trying to figure out what to do about it. Then the beverage cart appeared at the front of the cabin, and the flight attendants began making their way down the aisle. Shama was pushing the cart, her movements practiced and efficient. And behind her, supervising with that permanent look of irritation on her face, was Jacinta Morrison. Row by row they moved through the cabin. Tomato juice for the businessman in 12B. Coffee, black, for the woman in 15A. Ginger ale for the kid in 18F who looked a little airsick. The familiar dance of in-flight service, thousands of feet above the ground, proceeding exactly as it had on thousands of flights before. When they finally reached row 32, Shama looked at Divine and immediately noticed something was wrong. Divine's eyes were red from crying. Her face was drawn with pain. And even though Divine tried to sit up straighter, tried to put on a brave face, Shama could see she was struggling. Shama's voice was gentle when she asked Divine what she'd like to drink. Divine responded quietly, asking for just water, please, and apple juice for her daughter. Simple requests. Nothing unusual. But the way Divine said it, the exhaustion in her voice, the defeat, it made Shama's heart hurt. Shama smiled warmly at Divine, the kind of genuine smile that says, I see you're struggling, and I want to help. She asked Divine how she was feeling, and there was real concern in the question. Divine tried to smile back, tried to say she was okay, and thanked Shama for asking. It was such a small kindness, someone simply asking if she was okay, but after the cruelty she'd endured from Jacinta, it nearly made Divine break down all over again. Shama started preparing their drinks, carefully filling a cup with water, pouring apple juice into another cup, moving with care and attention. But Jacinta, standing right behind Shama, overheard the exchange. She rolled her eyes in that exaggerated way that makes it clear she wants you to see her doing it. Then she spoke up, her voice sharp with impatience, telling Shama they needed to keep moving. The implication was clear. Stop wasting time on pleasantries, stop coddling this passenger, just give her the drinks and move on. Shama's smile faltered slightly, but she finished preparing the drinks and handed them to Divine and Ameena. Divine thanked her quietly, and Shama gave her one more kind look before turning to push the cart forward. That's when it happened. As Shama started pushing the cart toward the next row, Jacinta, standing right behind her, deliberately jerked the cart. Not a big movement. Just enough to make it lurch suddenly. Just enough to cause the cup of water that Divine had just placed on her tray table to tip over. The cup fell and water spilled directly into Divine's lap, soaking through her pants, cold and shocking. Divine gasped and stood up quickly, her hands going to her wet clothing, her face a mixture of shock and humiliation. The water was everywhere, on her pants, on the seat, dripping onto the floor. Jacinta didn't even turn around. She just continued walking behind the cart, and over her shoulder, in a voice loud enough for multiple rows to hear, she said that Divine should be more careful. Should be more careful. As if Divine had spilled her own water. As if this was somehow her fault. The audacity of it, the sheer meanness of it, left several passengers staring in disbelief. They'd seen what happened. They'd watched Jacinta jerk that cart. They knew this wasn't an accident. And the murmur started. Quiet conversations between seatmates. Heads turning to look at Jacinta's back as she walked away. A general sense of disapproval spreading through that section of the cabin. But Ameena wasn't murmuring. Ameena was done being quiet. She stood up so fast her book fell off her lap, and her voice rang out clear and loud in the cabin. You did that on purpose too. Every head in the back section of the plane turned. Passengers who'd been dozing woke up. People pulled out their earbuds. Because an 8-year-old girl had just yelled an accusation at a flight attendant, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Jacinta stopped walking. Slowly, deliberately she turned around. And when she looked at Ameena, her expression was one of condescension mixed with irritation. "Excuse me, little girl," she said, her voice dripping with dismissal. The way she said "little girl" made it clear she thought Ameena was beneath her notice, that this child's accusations were meaningless. But Ameena didn't back down. Her voice was shaking, you could hear the tremor in it, but her words were firm and clear. She told Jacinta that she'd spilled her mama's water on purpose, just like she'd stepped on her foot on purpose. Divine immediately tried to pull Ameena back down into her seat, pleading with her to please sit down. Because Divine had been raised to avoid confrontation, to not make waves, to accept mistreatment quietly because fighting back only made things worse. She was terrified that Ameena was going to get them in trouble, that this was going to escalate, that somehow they would end up being blamed for disrupting the flight. But Ameena resisted her mother's pull, standing firm in that narrow space between the seats. Jacinta took 2 steps back toward them and leaned down, getting close to Ameena's face. When she spoke, her voice was sweet in that fake way that adults use when they're being condescending to children. "Sweetheart," she said, dragging the word out, "accidents happen. Maybe your mother should teach you some manners." The implication was clear. This child was being rude. This child was the problem. Not Jacinta. Not the grown woman who'd been tormenting a pregnant passenger. No, the problem was this 8-year-old girl who dared to speak up. Tears of anger were forming in Ameena's eyes now. Not sad tears. Not scared tears. Angry tears. The kind that come when you're so frustrated, so outraged by injustice, that your body doesn't know what else to do with all that emotion. Her voice cracked when she spoke, but the words came out anyway. "Maybe you should stop being mean." 6 words. Simple words. Words any 8-year-old might know. But they hung in the air like an indictment, and everyone within earshot knew they were true. The cabin had gone almost completely silent in that section. Passengers were watching this confrontation unfold with a mixture of shock and admiration. Shock that a child was standing up to a flight attendant like this. Admiration because someone was finally saying what they'd all been thinking. That this flight attendant was being mean. That her behavior was wrong. That someone needed to call it out. And that's when other passengers started speaking up. The man in seat 32A, a passenger named Donald, somewhere in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes, had been watching this entire situation unfold for the past hour. He'd seen Jacinta's cruelty at the bathroom. He'd seen the way Divine had limped back to her seat. And he'd just watched Jacinta deliberately spill water on a pregnant woman. Enough was enough. He spoke up, his voice firm and clear, addressing Jacinta directly. He told her that he'd seen what she did with that cart, and that it wasn't an accident. A woman in seat 31C, a passenger named Delight, chimed in immediately. She was in her 40s, a mother herself, and the protective instinct that comes with motherhood made her blood boil watching what was happening to Divine. Delight said she'd seen Jacinta step on Divine's foot earlier. She pointed out that this lady was clearly pregnant, and that Jacinta had been nothing but rude to her since they'd boarded. Other passengers nodded in agreement. A man across the aisle said he'd seen the bathroom incident. A woman 2 rows up said she'd noticed Jacinta's attitude from the beginning. Jacinta's face turned red. Not the red of embarrassment or shame. The red of anger. How dare these passengers question her? How dare they involve themselves in her business? She drew herself up and addressed the growing group of accusers with barely controlled fury. She told them she didn't have to explain herself to passengers. That if they had a complaint, they could file it after the flight. The message was clear. She was the authority here, not them, and their opinions didn't matter. Shamma stood frozen with the beverage cart, looking increasingly uncomfortable. She knew Jacinta was wrong. She'd suspected it from the beginning, but now it was undeniable. Multiple passengers were confirming it. An 8-year-old child was in tears over it. And Shamma was caught in an impossible position. She was new. Jacinta was senior. If Shamma spoke up against Jacinta, it could cost her her job. But if she said nothing, she was complicit in this cruelty. The moral weight of that choice was crushing, and Shamma made the coward's decision. She stayed silent. Jacinta walked away quickly, her back rigid with anger, leaving Shamma alone with the cart and a section of passengers who were all staring at her expectantly. Shamma felt their eyes on her, felt their judgment, and she couldn't blame them. She quietly abandoned the beverage service and gathered up napkins and a blanket. She brought them back to Divine, crouching down beside row 32 so she could speak quietly. She apologized, and the apology was genuine. She was so sorry. Then she asked Divine if she was okay. Divine, still trying to clean up the water, still trying not to make a fuss despite everything, asked quietly if there might be any ice. Her foot was really swollen now, she explained, and ice might help. Shamma's heart broke a little more. This woman wasn't yelling. Wasn't demanding to speak to a manager. Wasn't threatening lawsuits. She was just quietly asking for ice for her injured foot. Shamma promised she'd bring some right away, and she hurried off to get it, grateful for an excuse to escape the accusing stares of the passengers. After Shamma left, Ameena turned to her mother with an expression far too serious for an 8-year-old. She told Divine they had to tell someone about this. That Daddy would want them to tell someone. And she was right. If Victor had been there, if Divine's husband had witnessed any of what had happened on this flight, there would have been hell to pay. He wouldn't have sat quietly. He wouldn't have accepted this treatment. But Victor was thousands of miles away, deployed in a combat zone, unable to protect his family. And Divine, exhausted and in pain, didn't have any fight left in her. She asked Ameena a question that came from a place of pure defeat. Who would we tell, baby? Who would believe us? Who would care? But Ameena had been thinking. That's what she'd been doing for the past hour while her mother suffered. Thinking. Planning. Trying to figure out the right course of action. Ameena was a smart kid. Observant. She remembered things. And she remembered something specific from when they'd boarded the plane. There had been a pilot standing at the door, greeting passengers. She'd noticed him because of his uniform, because of those stripes on his shoulders that indicated rank. Her father had taught her about rank. About chain of command. About how in any organization there's a structure, and if someone at one level is failing, you go to the next level up. Flight attendants served passengers on planes. But pilots were in charge of planes. Pilots were like commanding officers. They were the ultimate authority on an aircraft. Ameena had heard her father say that before, talking about a flight he'd taken. The pilot is in charge, he'd said. What the pilot says goes. So if a flight attendant was doing something wrong, the pilot would be the person to tell. The pilot could make it stop. The pilot could fix this. That's what Ameena was thinking. That's the plan that had been forming in her young mind. She told her mother she needed to use the bathroom. Divine, still dealing with her wet clothes and swollen foot, asked if Ameena could wait. But Ameena insisted. No, Mama, she said. I really need to go. The urgency in her voice convinced Divine, who sighed and told her daughter to go ahead. Her foot hurt too much to accompany Ameena, so she just made her daughter promise to come right back. And if that mean lady said anything, Ameena should just ignore her and return to her seat immediately. Ameena promised she'd come right back, and then she stepped out into the aisle. But Ameena didn't walk toward the bathroom. She walked the other direction. Toward the front of the plane. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were shaking. She'd never done anything like this before. Never confronted authority. Never gone over someone's head to report them. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, past row after row of seats, past passengers who glanced at her curiously, wondering where this little girl was going all by herself. She reached the front galley where the lights were brighter and the space opened up slightly. And there, imposing and secure, was the cockpit door. Ameena had never seen a cockpit door up close before. It looked so official, so important, with its reinforced structure and its warning signs. She stood there for a moment, gathering her courage, trying to figure out exactly what she was going to say. How do you tell a pilot that a flight attendant has been hurting your mother? What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was making it up? Before she could knock, Shama appeared from the other galley, carrying a bag of ice for Divine. She saw Ameena standing at the cockpit door and immediately assumed the child was lost. She started to redirect Ameena, telling her, "Sweetie, are you looking for the bathroom? It's back that way." But Ameena turned to face Shama and said something that made the flight attendant stop in her tracks. She said she needed to talk to the pilot. "Please." Shama looked confused, concerned. She asked Ameena if something was wrong with the plane. Because that's the only reason a passenger would need to speak to the pilot during a flight, right? Some kind of emergency with the aircraft itself. But Ameena shook her head. "No," she said. "Something's wrong with that flight attendant. She hurt my mama." The words hung in the air between them. Shama's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise. Recognition. Guilt. Because Shama knew exactly which flight attendant Ameena was talking about. She'd been there for all of it. She'd seen Jacinta's behavior. She'd suspected the cart incident wasn't an accident. She'd heard the other passengers' accusations. And now here was this brave little girl, asking to speak to the pilot because the adults around her had failed to protect her mother. Shama looked at Ameena, really looked at her, and saw the tear tracks on her cheeks, saw the way her small hands were clenched into fists, saw the determination mixed with fear in her eyes. And Shama made a decision. The right decision this time. She told Ameena to wait there. Just for 1 second. Shama walked to the cockpit door and knocked in a specific pattern. She spoke into the intercom, her voice low so the passengers in the first-class cabin wouldn't hear. She said there was a situation that needed the captain's attention. Not an emergency. Not a security threat. But something that needed to be addressed immediately. There was a pause and then the cockpit door opened just slightly. The man who emerged was Captain Clement Okoye, and his presence immediately commanded respect. He was 48 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark skin and kind eyes set in a face that had seen 20 years of flying. Clement had been a pilot since before Ameena was born. He'd flown through storms and mechanical failures and medical emergencies at 35,000 feet. He'd landed planes with engine failures and navigated through some of the worst weather imaginable. But in all his years of flying, he'd never had a child knock on his cockpit door to report that a member of his crew was hurting people. Clement looked down at Ameena, and his expression softened. He knelt down so he was at her eye level, the way adults should when they want to really listen to a child. His voice was warm when he greeted her and asked her name. Ameena told him, her voice small but steady. And then, before he could ask anything else, she said the words that would change everything. She said her mama was hurt and that the flight attendant did it on purpose. If you've ever had to stand up for someone you love, if you've ever had to find courage you didn't know you had, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next is going to restore your faith in justice. Clement's expression became very serious. He told Ameena that was a very serious thing to say, and he needed her to tell him exactly what happened. And Ameena did. Standing there in the front galley of that aircraft, with passengers walking past to use the bathroom and glancing at this strange scene, 8-year-old Ameena Washington gave the clearest, most detailed account of abuse that Clement Okoye had ever heard from a child. She told him about the bathroom incident, about how the flight attendant had humiliated her mother and made her wait even though a passenger had offered to let her go first. She told him about the deliberate step on her mother's foot, about how she'd watched it happen, how she'd seen the flight attendant look down and step on purpose. She told him about the water being spilled, about the cart being jerked. And she told him that multiple passengers had seen it too. That it wasn't just her word. That other people knew what had happened. Clement listened to every word without interrupting. He watched Ameena's face as she spoke, looking for signs of exaggeration or confusion, but finding only the clear-eyed certainty of a child telling the truth. When Ameena finished, Clement asked her what her mother's seat number was. Ameena told him. 32E. He thanked Ameena for telling him, and he meant it. He told her that what she'd done was very brave, that she'd done the right thing, and that she should go sit with her mother now. He'd handle this. Ameena looked up at this tall pilot with his kind eyes and his authoritative presence, and she asked him a question. Are you going to make her apologize? Because in Ameena's 8-year-old understanding of justice, that's what happened when someone did something wrong. They apologized. They said sorry. They made it right. But Clement's answer was more complex. He told Ameena he was going to make sure her mother was safe and taken care of. That was his job. That was his responsibility. Every person on this aircraft was under his protection, and he took that responsibility very seriously. And when someone on his crew violated that trust, there would be consequences. Ameena nodded, satisfied with that answer, and turned to walk back to her seat. Her legs felt shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd told someone in authority what had happened, and he'd listened. He'd believed her. And he was going to do something about it. As she walked back down that aisle toward row 32, Ameena felt something she hadn't felt since this nightmare flight began. She felt hope. After Ameena walked back to her seat, Captain Clement Okoye stood in that front galley for a long moment, processing what he'd just heard. 20 years of flying. 20 years of dealing with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical problems, weather delays, and every other challenge that comes with being responsible for an aircraft and everyone on it. But this was different. This was a member of his crew deliberately harming a passenger. Not through negligence. Not through incompetence. Through deliberate, calculated cruelty. And the passenger in question was 7 months pregnant. Clement felt anger rising in his chest, the kind of anger that comes from a deep sense of justice being violated. Because when you're a pilot, every single person on that aircraft is your responsibility. Every single one. And someone had violated that trust in the worst possible way. He turned to Shama, who was still standing there with the bag of ice she'd been taking to Divine, and he asked her a direct question. He asked if what the child had told him was true. Shama's face told him everything before she even opened her mouth. The guilt was written all over her features. The shame of having witnessed wrongdoing and done nothing about it. She looked past Clement toward the back galley where Jacinta was reorganizing supplies, deliberately staying away from the passenger cabin, probably hoping the whole situation would just blow over. Shama knew she should report this. She'd known it from the bathroom incident. She'd known it when she saw Divine's swollen foot. She'd known it when the water spilled. But she'd been too afraid of the consequences, too worried about her job, too new to feel like she had any power. But now the captain was asking her directly, and Shama couldn't lie to him. She nodded slowly and told Clement to wait just 1 second. Then she knocked on the cockpit door and spoke through the intercom, her voice shaking slightly, asking if the captain could come out because there was a situation that needed his immediate attention. The co-pilot's voice came back asking if it was an emergency, and Shama said no, not a flight emergency, but something serious involving a passenger and a crew member. There was a pause and then the cockpit door opened. When Clement stepped fully into the galley, his presence seemed to fill the entire space. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing in his captain's uniform with 4 stripes on each shoulder indicating his rank. But despite his authoritative presence, his eyes were warm. Kind. The eyes of someone who genuinely cared about people. He was 48 years old, born in Nigeria and raised between Lagos and London before immigrating to the United States for flight school. He'd worked his way up from regional carriers to major airlines, had flown everything from small turboprops to massive international aircraft, and he'd earned every single one of those stripes through skill, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to the safety and well-being of his passengers. Clement looked down at Ameena, this small 8-year-old girl who'd had the courage to knock on his cockpit door, and he did something that many adults forget to do when talking to children. He knelt down. He got on her level so they could look each other in the eye, so she wouldn't have to crane her neck up at him, so she'd know he was taking her seriously. He greeted her warmly, his accent a melodic blend of Nigerian and British influences, and he asked her name. Ameena told him, her voice small but clear. And then, before Clement could ask any follow-up questions, Ameena said the words that would set everything in motion. "My mama is hurt and that flight attendant did it on purpose." Clement's expression became very serious. He told Ameena that was a serious accusation, a very serious thing to say about someone. But he didn't say it in a way that suggested he didn't believe her. He said it in a way that conveyed he understood the gravity of what she was telling him, and he needed to know everything. He asked her to tell him exactly what happened, and Ameena did. This 8-year-old girl, who'd been so scared just minutes before, who'd walked up that aisle with her heart pounding and her hands shaking, now gave the most detailed and clear account of abuse that Clement had ever heard. She started with the bathroom incident. She described how her mother had needed to use the restroom, how she'd stood in line, how a kind passenger had offered to let her go first because she was pregnant and clearly uncomfortable. She described how Jacinta had intervened, how she'd humiliated Divine in front of everyone, how she'd forced a 7-month pregnant woman to wait another 10 minutes when someone had willingly given up their place in line. Ameena's voice was steady as she recounted this, matter of fact, like she was giving a report in school. But Clement could see the hurt in her eyes, the confusion of a child trying to understand why an adult would be so deliberately unkind. Then Ameena described the incident in the aisle. She explained that her mother had been trying to get back to her seat after using the bathroom, that the captain had announced everyone should sit down because of turbulence, that her mother was trying to move as quickly as she could. She described the narrow aisle, the way Jacinta and her mother had met near row 28, the way her mother had politely asked to squeeze by. And then Ameena said something that made Clement's jaw tighten. She said she'd watched from her seat as Jacinta looked down at her mother's foot and deliberately stepped on it. Not accidentally bumped it. Not inadvertently made contact. Deliberately stepped down hard on her mother's toes. Ameena described the way her mother had cried out, the way she'd stumbled and grabbed onto a seat to keep from falling, the way she'd been shaking when she finally made it back to their row. And Ameena didn't stop there. She described the water incident. How Jacinta had jerked the beverage cart just as they were moving away from their row, how the water had spilled all over her mother's lap, how Jacinta had blamed her mother for not being more careful even though multiple passengers had seen what really happened. Ameena's voice cracked slightly when she talked about this part, the tears threatening to come back, but she pushed through. She told Clement that it wasn't just her word. She told him that other passengers had seen everything. The man in 32A. The woman in 31C. People in the rows around them. She wasn't making this up. She wasn't exaggerating. This had really happened and people had witnessed it. Then Ameena showed Clement her mother's seat number, pointing down the aisle toward the back of the plane where row 32 was located. Clement looked in that direction, then back at Ameena, and his face was grave. He thanked her for telling him, and his gratitude was genuine. He told her that what she'd done was very brave, that it took real courage to speak up like this, especially against an adult, especially in a situation where she might have been afraid no one would believe her. He told her to go sit with her mother now, that he would handle this situation, that she'd done her part and done it well. But Ameena had one more question. She looked up at this captain with his kind eyes and his impressive uniform, and she asked him if he was going to make the flight attendant apologize. Because in Ameena's understanding of how the world should work, when you hurt someone you said sorry. You acknowledged what you'd done wrong and you made amends. That's what her parents had taught her. That's what her teachers reinforced. You take responsibility for your actions and you apologize. So surely this adult who'd hurt her mother would have to apologize, right? Clement's answer was measured and thoughtful. He told Ameena that he was going to make sure her mother was safe and taken care of. That was his job as captain of this aircraft. Every person on this plane was under his protection, under his care, and he took that responsibility very seriously. He didn't make promises about apologies because he knew that what was coming for Jacinta Morrison was far more serious than a simple apology. But he wanted Ameena to understand that justice would be served, that her mother's well-being was his priority, that speaking up had been the right thing to do. Ameena nodded, satisfied with this answer even if it wasn't exactly what she'd asked for, and she turned to walk back to her seat. Clement watched her go, this small, brave child walking down the aisle with her shoulders back and her head held high. Then he stood up to his full height and his expression changed. The warm, kind eyes went hard. His jaw set with determination. And he began walking toward row 32 with long, purposeful strides. Passengers noticed him immediately. It's not every day you see the captain emerge from the cockpit and walk through the cabin during a flight. People looked up from their books and tablets. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Everyone watched as this imposing figure in his pilot's uniform made his way down the aisle, and there was something in his demeanor that told them this wasn't a casual walk-through to greet passengers. This was serious. When Clement reached row 32, he introduced himself to Divine, his voice professional but warm. Divine looked up at him with surprise and immediate embarrassment written all over her face. She hadn't wanted Ameena to make a fuss. She hadn't wanted to cause trouble. She just wanted to get through this flight quietly and forget any of this had ever happened. But her daughter had gone to the captain, and now here he was, and Divine felt mortified. She started to apologize, to say that everything was fine, that they didn't need to bother him, but Clement gently cut her off. He told Divine that her daughter had reported she'd been injured by a member of his crew. Then he asked, politely but firmly, if he could see her foot. Divine hesitated. She didn't want to show him. Didn't want to make this into a bigger thing than it already was. But Clement waited patiently, and something in his steady gaze told Divine that he wasn't going to just walk away. So reluctantly she lifted her injured foot. She'd gotten her shoe back on with difficulty, but now she slipped it off again to show him. The swelling had gotten worse in the past hour. Her foot was puffy and discolored, the area where Jacinta's heel had come down now showing a distinct bruise. It looked painful because it was painful. Every throb sent waves of discomfort up Divine's leg. Clement's expression hardened as he examined the injury. He asked Divine how many months pregnant she was, though he could clearly see she was quite far along. 7 months, Divine told him quietly. Clement's jaw clenched. Then he asked her directly if it was true that she'd been struck on the foot and had water deliberately spilled on her by a flight attendant. His voice was carefully controlled, but Divine could hear the anger underneath it. The righteous anger of someone who's just discovered that a person under their authority has betrayed their trust and harmed someone vulnerable. Divine started to respond, started to downplay it, started to say maybe it was an accident, but she didn't get far. Because Donald, the man in seat 32A, spoke up loudly and clearly. He confirmed everything. He said he'd seen the flight attendant deliberately jerk that beverage cart. He said it wasn't an accident. He said he'd also witnessed the bathroom incident, the way the flight attendant had humiliated this pregnant woman for no reason. Then Delight, the woman in 31C, chimed in. She said she'd seen the flight attendant step on Divine's foot in the aisle. She said she'd watched the whole thing and it was absolutely deliberate. The flight attendant had looked down, seen the foot, and stepped on it on purpose. 2 other passengers nearby added their voices to the chorus. A woman in row 33 said she'd seen the water incident. A man in row 31 said he'd noticed the flight attendant's hostile attitude toward this passenger from the beginning of the flight. Within seconds, Clement had multiple independent witnesses all confirming the same story. This wasn't a case of one passenger making accusations that might or might not be true. This was a clear pattern of abuse witnessed by half a dozen people. Clement thanked the passengers for speaking up, and his gratitude was genuine. Then he turned back to Divine, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of official authority. He told her he wanted to apologize on behalf of Pinnacle Airways. He said what had happened to her was completely unacceptable, that it should never have happened, that it violated every policy and principle the airline stood for. Divine's eyes filled with tears at the simple acknowledgement that she'd been wronged, that she hadn't deserved this treatment, that someone in authority believed her and was taking her side. Clement called Shama over with a sharp gesture. When she hurried up, he gave her a series of instructions in a voice that made it clear these weren't suggestions. He told her to get the first aid kit immediately. He told her to bring him incident report forms. And then he told her to inform Flight Attendant Morrison that the captain needed to speak with her. No. Not in 5 minutes. Not when she was finished with whatever she was doing. No. The urgency and authority in his voice made several passengers nearby sit up straighter. Something significant was about to happen and everyone could feel it. Shama rushed off to carry out his orders, and Clement crouched down beside Divine's seat so he could speak to her more privately. He asked if she was experiencing any pain beyond her foot, any cramping or discomfort related to the pregnancy. Divine admitted that she'd been worried about the baby, that the stress and the physical trauma had her concerned, but the baby seemed to be moving normally. Clement told her they'd be landing in Seattle in less than 2 hours, but if she experienced any concerning symptoms before then, any contractions or unusual pain, she was to tell him immediately and he'd arrange for medical personnel to meet them on the ground. Divine nodded, touched by his concern, by the fact that he was treating her like a person who mattered rather than an inconvenient problem. Meanwhile, in the back galley, Shama had found Jacinta and delivered the captain's message. Jacinta's initial reaction was irritation. She asked what this was about, her tone suggesting she thought this was some minor issue that didn't warrant the captain's personal attention. But Shama's face must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because Jacinta's expression changed. A flicker of worry crossed her features. She asked if this was about that passenger who'd been complaining. Shama didn't answer, just told her again that the captain wanted to see her immediately. Jacinta walked toward the front of the plane, and her demeanor was still defiant. Still convinced that she could talk her way out of this, that her seniority would protect her, that the captain would take her side over some random passenger's complaints. She reached the front galley where Clement was waiting, and she greeted him with false brightness. "Yes, Captain?" Her tone was almost challenging, like she was annoyed at being summoned. Clement's response was cold and clipped. "In the galley." No. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The authority in those 4 words was absolute. Jacinta's defiance wavered slightly, but she followed him into the front galley. Clement closed the curtain behind them, creating a semblance of privacy, though passengers in the first few rows of first class could still see shadows moving behind the thin fabric and could catch occasional words. What happened in that galley over the next few minutes would become the subject of much speculation among the passengers who witnessed it. They couldn't hear most of the conversation, but they could see the body language. They could see Clement standing tall and rigid, his posture radiating anger. They could see Jacinta initially gesturing defensively, her hands moving as she presumably made excuses. They could see the way she pointed toward the back of the plane, likely trying to blame Divine somehow. And they could see the moment when Clement's response cut through whatever excuse she was making. His voice rose just once, loud enough for several rows to hear clearly. "I don't care about your excuses. That woman is 7 months pregnant." The words hung in the cabin air like an indictment. Passengers exchanged glances. Some nodded in approval. Others pulled out their phones, not to record but to text friends and family about what they were witnessing. A flight attendant was getting absolutely destroyed by her captain, and it was clear she deserved every second of it. Through the curtain crack, passengers watched Jacinta's body language change dramatically. The defensiveness melted away. Her shoulders slumped. Her gesturing became less aggressive, more pleading. She was scared now. Really scared. Because she was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to blow over, that she wasn't going to be able to smooth talk her way out of this, that there would be real consequences for what she'd done. Clement continued talking, his voice lower now but still firm, and Jacinta just stood there taking it, occasionally trying to interject but being shut down each time. Back in row 32, Shama was attending to Divine with genuine care and concern. She brought the first aid kit and was carefully wrapping Divine's foot with an ice pack, securing it in place with medical tape. She checked Divine's vital signs, asked questions about the baby's movements, made sure Divine was comfortable. And she apologized again multiple times, her voice thick with guilt. She said she should have reported Jacinta's behavior earlier, that she'd known something was wrong, that she was sorry for not speaking up sooner. Divine, ever gracious even in her pain, told Shama it wasn't her fault, that she understood Shama was in a difficult position. After what felt like an eternity but was really only about 3 minutes, Clement emerged from the galley. Jacinta followed a few steps behind, and the change in her was visible to everyone. Her face was blotchy and red. Her eyes were wet with tears she was trying to hold back. Her carefully maintained professional appearance had crumbled entirely. She looked like someone who'd just been told their world was ending. Which in many ways she had been. Clement walked straight back to row 32, and when he spoke to Divine, his voice carried authority that made passengers several rows away go silent to listen. He told Divine that he had grounded Flight Attendant Morrison effective immediately. She would not be serving for the remainder of this flight. She would be confined to the crew rest area until they landed, at which point she would be escorted off the aircraft by airport security. He was filing a formal incident report, and there would be a full investigation into her conduct. He wanted Divine to know that he took this situation with the utmost seriousness, and there would be consequences. Divine, still trying to be the peacemaker even after everything, said she didn't want to cause trouble. But Clement cut her off gently but firmly. He told her she didn't cause anything. She did. He gestured subtly toward where Jacinta stood frozen near the galley. He explained that Pinnacle Airways had a zero-tolerance policy for crew members mistreating passengers, and that policy applied even more strictly when the passenger in question was vulnerable. A 7-month pregnant woman who'd been deliberately injured by a flight attendant? That wasn't just a policy violation. That was potentially criminal assault. Ameena, who'd been listening to all of this with wide eyes, asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the captain first appeared. Is she going to say sorry? The innocent hope in her voice, the belief that adults who did wrong things should apologize, made several nearby passengers smile sadly. Ameena still believed in a world where justice was simple and straightforward. Clement looked at Ameena, really looked at her, and that's when he noticed something. On the small backpack tucked under the seat in front of Ameena, there was a luggage tag. And on that tag was a symbol he recognized immediately. A military deployment tag. The kind that soldiers put on their families' luggage to identify them as military dependents when they travel. Clement's expression softened, and he asked Ameena a question. Your father is deployed? Ameena nodded, and suddenly everything made even more sense to Clement. This little girl had been forced to grow up fast. Had learned to be the protector because her father was overseas defending his country. Had taken on responsibilities no 8-year-old should have to carry. And when her mother had been hurt, she'd done exactly what her father would have wanted. She'd stood up. She'd fought back. She'd protected her family. Clement knelt down one more time so he was at Ameena's level. He told her that her father had trusted him, had trusted this airline, to make sure Ameena and her mother got home safely. And he told her he took that trust very seriously. That every military family that flew on his aircraft was under his personal protection. That he understood the sacrifice her family was making with her father deployed overseas, and he would not allow anyone to disrespect that sacrifice by mistreating them. If you're feeling emotional right now, if this story is hitting you right in the heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because we're about to get to the ending, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when this plane lands. Ameena looked up at Captain Clement Okoye, this stranger who'd become their protector, and she said something simple. Thank you. 2 words that carried the weight of all her relief, all her gratitude, all her exhaustion from trying to be strong for her mother. Clement smiled at her, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes, and told her she was welcome. Then he stood up, spoke briefly with Shama about continuing to monitor Divine's condition for the rest of the flight, and walked back toward the cockpit. As he passed Jacinta, who was still standing frozen near the galley, he didn't even look at her. She was already gone in his mind. Already removed from his crew. Already a problem he dealt with and moved past. Jacinta watched him walk away, and the full reality of her situation finally crashed down on her. Her career was over. Her reputation was destroyed. And depending on what Divine decided to do, she might be facing criminal charges. All because she'd been cruel to the wrong person. All because she'd let her bitterness and anger drive her to hurt someone who'd done nothing wrong. All because she'd forgotten that actions have consequences. The final hour of the flight passed in a strange, tense silence in the back section of the aircraft. Divine sat with her foot elevated and wrapped in ice, trying to process everything that had just happened. Ameena sat beside her, holding her mother's hand, watching the clouds pass by through the window. Other passengers in their section kept glancing back at them, offering supportive smiles, giving them space but making it clear through small gestures that they were on their side. The man in 32A, Donald, had given Ameena a pack of cookies from his carry-on. The woman in 31C, Delight, had offered Divine her own pillow. Small kindnesses from strangers who'd witnessed an injustice and wanted to help make it right. Jacinta Morrison spent that final hour confined to the crew rest area, a small compartment away from passengers where flight attendants could take breaks on long flights. But this wasn't a break. This was exile. Shama checked on her once, brought her water, but didn't engage in conversation. What could she say? Jacinta sat in that tiny space, her mind racing, probably going through every decision that had led to this moment. Every cruel comment. Every deliberate act of malice. Every time she'd let her bitterness poison her actions. And now it had all caught up with her in the worst possible way. Captain Clement had radioed ahead to Seattle before they began their descent. He'd filed an official incident report mid-flight, documenting everything. The injuries to a pregnant passenger. The multiple witness testimonies. The pattern of deliberate harassment and assault. He'd contacted Pinnacle Airways corporate headquarters. He'd notified airport security that there would need to be officers waiting when they landed. And he'd made it absolutely clear that this wasn't just an internal airline matter. This was potentially a criminal matter. Assault on a pregnant woman wasn't just grounds for termination. It was grounds for arrest. The plane began its descent into Seattle. The flight attendants, now just Shama and the 2 working the forward cabin who'd been blissfully unaware of the drama in economy, began their landing preparations. Passengers were asked to return their seats to the upright position, to stow their tray tables, to turn off electronic devices. The familiar rituals of landing that happened thousands of times a day on thousands of flights. But this landing was different. Because everyone in the back section of that aircraft knew what was waiting on the ground. Justice. The wheels touched down on the Seattle runway with that characteristic chirp and rumble. The engines reversed thrust with their loud roar. The plane slowed, taxied toward the gate, and finally came to a complete stop with that slight lurch as the brakes fully engaged. Normally, this is when passengers would immediately leap up, grabbing their bags from overhead bins, crowding the aisles in their eagerness to deplane. But Captain Clement's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that made everyone freeze. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have a situation that needs to be resolved before we can begin deplaning. Thank you for your patience. His voice was calm and professional, giving nothing away, but passengers looked at each other knowingly. Especially those in the back who knew exactly what situation needed resolving. They stayed in their seats, many of them watching the forward galley area where the door would open. The jetway connected to the aircraft with a soft thump. There was a pause, the kind of pause that seems to stretch on forever when you're waiting for something significant to happen. And then the door opened. But instead of passengers being allowed to exit, people entered. 2 airport security officers in their distinctive uniforms came through the door first. Behind them was a woman in a professional business suit with a badge clipped to her belt. Airport police. Her expression was serious, all business, and she was clearly in charge. The three of them moved through the first-class cabin without a word, passengers craning their necks to watch them pass. They walked straight to the crew rest area where Jacinta had been confined. Shama opened the door for them, and Jacinta emerged looking smaller somehow than she had before. The defeat was written all over her posture, the way her shoulders slumped, the way she couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. But there was still a flicker of defiance there, still a part of her that couldn't quite accept that this was really happening. The lead security officer addressed her formally, his voice carrying through the now completely silent cabin. "Jacinta Morrison? We need you to come with us." Jacinta's response was immediate and defensive. What? She looked between the officers and the detective, genuine confusion mixed with growing panic on her face. "I didn't do anything illegal." The words came out too loud, too emphatic, like if she said them forcefully enough they would somehow become true. But the officer's expression didn't change. He'd clearly dealt with plenty of people who insisted they hadn't done anything wrong even when the evidence said otherwise. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone remaining professional and measured, "you've been accused of assault on a pregnant passenger. We're detaining you for questioning." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Assault. Not rude behavior. Not poor customer service. Assault. A criminal charge. Something that could result in jail time. Jacinta's face went through a rapid series of emotions. Disbelief. Fear. And finally, a desperate attempt to argue. She started to protest, started to say this was all a misunderstanding, that the passenger was exaggerating, that she hadn't done anything that warranted police involvement. But the detective cut her off with a raised hand and a firm voice. "Ma'am, you can explain your side of the story at the station. Right now we need you to come with us." And then she nodded to one of the security officers, who pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The sight of those handcuffs seemed to break through Jacinta's denial. Her eyes went wide. Her breath came faster. She looked around the cabin as if searching for someone who would intervene, who would tell these officers they were making a mistake. But all she saw were passengers watching with expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity. Many had their phones out, recording this moment. The video of a flight attendant being arrested for assaulting a passenger would be all over social media within hours. The handcuffs clicked into place around Jacinta's wrists, and something seemed to crumble inside her. The defiance drained away completely, replaced by the stark reality of consequences. She was led down the aisle toward the exit, and passengers watched in silence. Some with grim satisfaction. Others with a sense that justice was being served. A few with sadness at seeing anyone's life fall apart so completely, even if they'd brought it on themselves. As Jacinta passed row 32, she glanced briefly at Divine and Ameena. What expression crossed her face in that moment? Anger? Regret? Shame? It was hard to say. But she looked away quickly and continued her walk of shame toward the aircraft door. Ameena watched the entire thing with wide eyes. She squeezed her mother's hand tightly and Divine squeezed back. Divine was crying, but not from pain this time. These were tears of relief. Relief that someone had believed her. Relief that she hadn't been told to just accept the abuse and move on. Relief that her daughter's bravery had led to real consequences for someone who'd deliberately hurt her. Relief that in a world that so often feels unjust, justice had actually been served. She watched Jacinta disappear through the aircraft door, flanked by officers, and something heavy lifted from her chest. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. After Jacinta was removed from the aircraft, there was a collective exhale throughout the cabin. Passengers started talking in low voices, processing what they'd just witnessed. Captain Clement's voice came back over the intercom, thanking everyone for their patience and explaining that deplaning could now begin. But before the general rush to exit could start, something else happened. A man in an expensive suit entered the aircraft and spoke briefly with Captain Clement. Then, instead of exiting, he walked directly toward the back of the plane. Toward row 32. The man was Will Abernathy, 45 years old, Regional Director for Pinnacle Airways for the Pacific Northwest region. He'd been called by corporate headquarters the moment Captain Clement filed his mid-flight incident report. He'd been waiting at the gate, coordinating with airport police, reviewing the preliminary details of what had happened, and preparing for what he knew would be a public relations nightmare. A pregnant passenger assaulted by a flight attendant? Video of the arrest already circulating online? This was the kind of incident that could damage an airline's reputation for years if not handled properly. But Will wasn't just thinking about reputation management. He was genuinely appalled by what he'd read in that report. He'd spent 20 years in the airline industry, and he'd never heard of anything quite this egregious. When Will reached row 32, he addressed Divine formally but with warmth in his voice. "Mrs. Washington?" Divine looked up at him, confused and a bit wary. Another authority figure. Another person who might tell her this was somehow her fault or that she needed to sign something agreeing not to sue or any number of things that might minimize what had happened to her. But Will's first words put those fears to rest. He introduced himself, gave her his title, and then said something that made Divine's eyes fill with tears again. "On behalf of Pinnacle Airways, I want to offer you our deepest apologies." Divine's response was weary and heartfelt. She said she just wanted to get to her sister's house. She was exhausted physically and emotionally. Her foot was throbbing despite the ice. She was worried about the baby. She'd been traumatized by hours of abuse followed by the surreal experience of watching her abuser be arrested. She didn't want to deal with corporate representatives or fill out forms or negotiate settlements. She just wanted this day to be over. Will understood. He nodded and said of course absolutely they could get to her sister's house. But first he needed her to know a few things. He told her that Ms. Morrison had been terminated effective immediately. Not suspended pending investigation. Not put on administrative leave. Terminated. Fired. Her employment with Pinnacle Airways was over the moment those handcuffs clicked into place. Will explained that the airline was launching a full investigation into how this had happened, how someone with such poor judgment and cruel tendencies had remained employed for so long, what warning signs had been missed. But that investigation was for their benefit to fix their systems. For Divine, the important thing was that her abuser was gone and would never work for Pinnacle Airways again. Then Will pulled out his business card and handed it to Divine. He told her that all medical expenses related to her injury would be covered by the airline. Doctor visits, x-rays if needed, physical therapy if the injury required it, any medication prescribed, everything. She wouldn't pay a single dollar out of pocket. He told her that Pinnacle Airways took full responsibility for what had happened to her, and they wanted to make it right in whatever way they could. Divine took the card with shaking hands, still not quite believing what she was hearing. But Will wasn't finished. He told her that Pinnacle Airways was also offering her family complimentary flights on their airline for the next 10 years. Divine's head snapped up at that. She'd heard him wrong. She must have. 10 years? She repeated it like a question, like she needed confirmation that he'd actually said what she thought he'd said. Will nodded solemnly. 10 years, he confirmed. It's the least we can do. He told her that what had happened to her should never happen to anyone, but especially not on one of their flights. That every passenger deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, and when that didn't happen, when one of their employees violated that basic principle, the airline needed to do more than just apologize. They needed to demonstrate through meaningful action that they valued her and her family. Divine was stunned into silence. 10 years of free flights. For a teacher's salary, for a military family living paycheck to paycheck, that was an enormous gift. That was flights to visit family. Flights for vacations they might never have been able to afford otherwise. Flights so Victor could come home on leave without them having to scrape together airfare. That was security. That was possibility. That was a corporation actually backing up their apology with something substantial. She didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate, but she said it anyway, her voice thick with emotion. Then Will turned his attention to Ameena. He crouched down just like Captain Clement had done, getting on her level. He told her that she'd been incredibly brave to speak up. That what she'd done, going to the captain, reporting what had happened, standing up for her mother, that took real courage. He told her that her father would be proud of her. And those words, that acknowledgement of her father who was so far away, who couldn't be there to protect them but who Ameena had tried to honor by protecting her mother herself, those words made Ameena smile for the first time in hours. Ameena looked up at her mother with excitement lighting up her face. Can we tell him when he calls tonight? The hope and pride in her voice were infectious. Divine smiled through her tears and nodded. Yes, baby. We'll tell him everything. And she knew Victor would be proud. Proud of Ameena's bravery. Probably angry that any of this had happened in the first place, angry that he hadn't been there to protect them. But ultimately proud that his 8-year-old daughter had stepped up and done what needed to be done. After Will left, giving them his personal cell phone number and making them promise to call if they needed anything at all, Divine and Ameena finally deplaned. They moved slowly, Divine limping on her injured foot, Ameena carrying both their backpacks again. Other passengers from their section waited to let them go first, and as they passed, people spoke words of encouragement. I'm glad you're okay. Your daughter is amazing. That flight attendant got what she deserved. You did the right thing speaking up. The support from strangers, from people who'd witnessed their ordeal and cared enough to say something kind, meant more than Divine could express. They made their way through the jetway into the terminal, following the signs toward baggage claim. Divine was focused on just putting one foot in front of the other, on making it to where Jem would be waiting, on getting through these final steps of their journey. Ameena walked beside her mother, staying close, still in protector mode, watching to make sure her mama didn't need help. And then they turned a corner and there she was. Jem. Divine's sister Jem was 31 years old, 3 years younger than Divine, and she'd been worried sick. She'd been tracking the flight on her phone, and when she saw it was delayed on the ground after landing, she'd gotten nervous. Something had happened. She didn't know what, but something wasn't right. So when she finally spotted Divine and Ameena coming down the escalator toward baggage claim, she ran. She ran through the crowd of waiting people, dodging luggage carts and distracted travelers, and swept both of them into a fierce hug. "Are you okay?" Jem asked, pulling back to look at her sister's face, seeing the tear tracks and the exhaustion and knowing something significant had happened. "I was tracking your flight, I saw it was delayed." "What happened?" Divine's response was understated in that way people have when they're too tired to fully explain something traumatic. "It's a long story," she said. But Ameena wasn't too tired. Ameena, with all the straightforward honesty of a child, announced proudly that she'd yelled at a mean lady and the lady got arrested. Jem's eyes went wide. "You what?" She looked between her niece and her sister, trying to piece together how any flight could result in that sentence being true. And despite everything, despite the pain and the trauma and the exhaustion, they laughed. All three of them standing there in the Seattle airport baggage claim, laughing with the kind of relief that comes after surviving something difficult, laughing because they were together and safe and the worst was behind them. They collected their luggage and walked together toward the exit, Jem supporting Divine on one side, Ameena on the other, forming a protective unit around the pregnant woman who'd endured so much. As they walked, Divine started telling Jem the story, and Jem's expression went from shock to outrage to proud as she heard about everything her sister and niece had been through and how they'd handled it. They pushed through the automatic doors into the cool Seattle air, and Divine took a deep breath. They'd made it. Against all odds, despite the cruelty of one bitter woman, they'd made it to Seattle. They were safe. They were together. And justice had been served. Sometimes standing up for what's right means using your voice, even when you're small. Ameena learned that day that protecting the people you love isn't just about being big or strong. Sometimes it's about being brave enough to say, "This is wrong and someone needs to hear it." It's about trusting that your voice matters, that your testimony has weight, that speaking truth to power can actually change things. She learned that silence in the face of injustice only allows that injustice to continue, but speaking up, even when you're scared, even when you're just a kid, can stop cruelty in its tracks. Have you ever had to find courage you didn't know you had to stand up for yourself or someone you love? Drop your story in the comments, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Jacinta Morrison was formally charged with assault. The video that passengers had taken of her being led off the plane in handcuffs went viral, racking up millions of views across social media. The incident became a case study in airline employee training programs about the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Jacinta's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but with so many witnesses and such clear evidence of intentional harm, the prosecution had a strong case. She eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and received probation, community service, and a permanent mark on her criminal record that would make finding work in any customer-facing industry nearly impossible. But more importantly than what happened to Jacinta, let's talk about what happened to the Washington family. Divine made it safely through the rest of her pregnancy. The injury to her foot healed within a few weeks, though she'd occasionally feel a twinge of pain when the weather changed, a reminder of that terrible flight. She spent those final months with Jem, the two sisters growing even closer as they prepared for the baby's arrival. They talked about the flight, about Ameena's bravery, about how proud Victor would be when he heard the whole story. 3 months after that flight, Divine went into labor. It was a Tuesday evening, and Jem rushed her to the hospital while Ameena stayed with a neighbor. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and at 3:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, Victor Jr. came into the world. 7 pounds, 5 ounces of healthy, screaming baby boy. When they video called Victor in his deployment location to show him his son for the first time, the tough Army sergeant cried. He cried seeing his baby boy. He cried hearing his wife tell him how brave Ameena had been. He cried from the frustration of being so far away when his family needed him. But mostly he cried from pride and love. Ameena fell in love with her baby brother immediately. She'd been worried she might be jealous, might resent no longer being the only child, but the moment she held him, those fears evaporated. She became the best big sister, always wanting to help, always checking on him, already taking on that protector role that she'd learned on that flight to Seattle. And when people asked her about her brother, she'd tell them proudly that his name was Victor Jr., but they called him VJ, and that his very first flight was free because her mama was a hero and she'd helped make sure everyone knew it. The Pinnacle Airways corporate headquarters sent flowers when VJ was born. Will Abernathy, the regional director who'd apologized at the airport, sent a personalized card congratulating them and reminding them that their 10 years of complimentary flights started whenever they were ready to use them. The first time they used those free flights was 6 months later when Victor finally came home from deployment. Pinnacle Airways upgraded the entire family to first class for that reunion flight, and the flight attendants treated them like royalty. Divine had been nervous about flying again, worried she'd have flashbacks to that terrible day, but the crew went out of their way to make the experience positive, and by the end of the flight she felt her faith in air travel restored. Over the next 10 years, the Washington family took full advantage of those complimentary flights. They flew to visit Victor's parents in North Carolina. They flew to Disney World when the kids were old enough to appreciate it. They flew to Hawaii for their 15th wedding anniversary, leaving the kids with Jem for a long overdue romantic getaway. Each time they flew, Divine would remember that day and she'd look at Ameena, who grew from a brave 8-year-old into an even braver young woman, and she'd feel grateful. Grateful that her daughter had found her voice. Grateful that people had listened. Grateful that justice sometimes actually prevails. And Ameena? She never forgot the lesson she learned that day. That your voice matters. That speaking up against injustice is not just right, it's necessary. That being small doesn't mean being powerless. She carried that lesson through middle school when she stood up to bullies picking on a kid with disabilities. She carried it through high school when she joined the debate team and learned to use her voice to advocate for causes she believed in. She carried it to college where she majored in social justice and criminal law. And she carried it into her career where she became an advocate for victims of discrimination and abuse, using her voice to amplify the voices of others who were struggling to be heard. On her office wall, she kept a framed photograph. It was a picture of her as an 8-year-old, standing in front of an airplane, the same week as that fateful flight. In the photo, she's smiling, excited for her first time flying, completely unaware of what was about to happen. She kept that photo as a reminder. A reminder that you never know when you'll be called upon to be brave. That you never know when you'll need to stand up and say, "This is wrong and I'm not going to be silent about it." That sometimes the most important thing you can do is use your voice, even when you're scared, even when you're unsure, even when you're just a kid who doesn't know if anyone will listen. They listened. And because they did, a pregnant woman got justice. A cruel person faced consequences. A family received acknowledgement and compensation for their trauma. And a little girl learned that her voice, her truth, her courage could change the world. Maybe not the whole world, but her world. Her mother's world. And sometimes that's enough.